Hello, everyone. My name is David Betancourt, and I'm here on behalf of Heraeus Medical Components. And today we'll be discussing Nitinol Simplified. During the course of today's video, we're going to be covering a couple of topics. We'll be discussing Nitinol in the medical device marketplace, going over the basics and an introduction into Nitinol, and then finally discussing the importance of vendor selection when looking to partner with a manufacturing organization on any new Nitinol projects that you have. Before we get started, I would just like to take a moment to allow myself and my colleague to provide a little background on ourselves and our experience in the industry. My name is David Betancourt, and I have been with Heraeus Medical Components for over 11 years now. I have a bachelor's in chemical engineering, and I've been working in the medical device marketplace for over 25 years. And now I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Brock Groth.
Thanks, Dave. I started working with Nitinol in the mid-90s in grad school. I came out to the California, San Francisco Bay Area about that time. And since then, I've been working at the nexus of Nitinol and medical devices. I've worked with several companies and probably about 200 projects. So quite a bit of Nitinol project experience.
Thanks, Brock. And with that, we'll move on to the heart of our presentation. Before we get into the topic of Nitinol, I'd just like to share a little bit of information on Heraeus Medical Components. Heraeus Medical Components is part of the larger Heraeus organization. We are a family-owned German manufacturing company that has been in medical devices for over 30 years now. Heraeus as an organization supports growing manufacturing fields that are centered around 4 primary clusters. And you can see those presented on this slide. The healthcare industry and medical components specifically is the focus of our organization. And we have spent these last 30 years working across a wide variety of different types of products and solution creation for our customers. Heraeus Medical Components has seen a large increase in the amount of partnership and outsourcing of both components and larger scale manufacturing in the last 5 years. And we see this trend continuing over the next 5 years. So it makes it critically important for med device companies to be able to find those companies that they can partner with and that they can trust to provide the highest quality products and high-level solutions for the upcoming challenges in the future. Heraeus Medical Components is built on a foundation supporting multiple different types of products across the entire developmental cycle. As you can see here, we really speak about early design and developmental support all the way through the ability to provide final devices to our customers. This is the foundation of our ability to support a wide variety of customer needs, but more importantly, to position ourselves to be a solution provider that can be flexible, yet have the higher level of engineering and technical support required for our diverse customers. We have worked very closely in multiple marketplaces, as you can see here. And with Nitinol, what we're truly seeing is an explosive growth in the area of what can be considered the interventional marketplace with applications in neurovascular, peripheral vascular, structural heart, and other emerging markets. Heraeus as an organization has manufacturing locations across the world. We are focused in manufacturing in the United States, Europe, and in Asia. This allows us to provide both a global presence for our customers and also provide localization as necessary to work closely with our customers wherever they might have design or manufacturing locations. Now let's talk a little bit about Nitinol and how we see it currently in the med device marketplace. Nitinol is a very interesting material. Since its main introduction in the late 1980s, we've really seen it slowly grow and now rapidly grow in its use. The material itself is used across many multiple applications, but what companies really like to take advantage of is the superelastic properties of the material. And today, when we're discussing nitinol as a material, we're going to go into that and what it means for the material and how you can leverage that for your products of the future. In thinking about how nitinol is used in the marketplace, there are a certain consistent amount of challenge that we see. And as you can see here, it's really talking about this material being able to provide our customers the ability to work with minimally invasive procedures, looking at reducing the amount of total products that used, and then again, reducing down the complexity of the products. Between the years of 2012 to 2019, we saw the amount of nitinol used in the marketplace double. And we expect between 2019 and 2025 to see it double yet again. Nitinol is a material that has a broad and wide range of applications, and it's going to become an even more critical part of medical device products going forward. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to turn this over to my colleague, Brock Groth, who's going to walk you through basics on nitinol, how the material works, and how we're able to leverage these properties in the production of products for our customers.
Thanks, Dave. As Dave was saying, this is a nitinol material overview. We're going to move pretty quickly in the interest of time. You probably will have some questions later. Our contact information will be provided, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you have later that are not addressed in this presentation, or work with you on any projects that you might be have in your pipeline. As Dave mentioned, a lot of medical devices use superelasticity. This is the ability for the material to be bent quite far relative to other metals and then bounce back. I think of it as the opposite of a metal coat hanger. Most people have taken a metal coat hanger and bent it to some shape to grab something out from underneath the couch or something like that, and it takes that shape set very easily. Superelasticity, you bend it very far and it bounces back quite well. Shape memory is a little bit of a blend of the two, and you bend it and it stays bent, and then you apply heat and it bounces back. And if you go to the next slide, we've got a little graphic that shows this. So here, the shape memory effect and the superelastic effect are relative of the environment that the device is operating in or performing in. So there's a transition temperature of the material, and if the transition temperature of the material is above the environment that the room is, you'll have shape memory. You bend it, it'll stay bent, and then you drop it in a bucket of hot water or something like that, and it will go back to its original shape. If you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how there's an interplay between these. So if you have a superelastic material, the room temperature or the environment that the device is performing in, the transition temperature is below that temperature. So if you bend it, it automatically bounces back. But if you take that material and you cool it, you put it in a bucket of ice water or maybe dry ice and alcohol, depending upon the transition temperature of the material. Now, when you bend it, that material will take a set, and then when you heat it back up, it will return to its shape. So there's this relationship between shape memory and superelasticity. They seem different because we're used to living and operating in a room temperature environment for most of our existence. But functionally, what's going on within the material is the same in both shape memory and superelasticity. So how does nitinol work, and what kind of gives it these unusual properties? So on the right here, we've got a graph. This is a stress strain curve of multiple materials. And so highlighted is nickel titanium. This is a pull to failure test on just a standard tensile test. Imagine this is a wire being pulled, and you can see that just the shape of the nitinol curve is drastically different than the other materials presented here. These are aluminum and steel and a different type of steel piano wire. I don't want to get into the details of how close the one curve is aluminum to steel. All of these materials, particularly nitinol, these forces can be adjusted in the way that the material is processed. But the drastic shape of these curves is what I want to highlight here. So nitinol starts off with the linear elastic phase, the same as steel does, but then it has this flat part, this loading plateau where you get a lot of movement without a force increase, and then it continues from there, and then ultimately does permanently deform and break. And so let's dive into this a little bit more on the next slide. So here we've gotten rid of the conventional materials and we're just focusing on the nitinol. And now, instead of a straight pull to failure test, imagine this is a wire in your tensile tester. Instead of just pulling it straight to failure, what we're doing is we're pulling it to 6% and then returning it back to zero load and then pulling it a second time. And so what happens is you get this linear elastic set right off the beginning, this linear elastic section, I mean, and then at about 1%, at about 500 megapascals here, there's this loading plateau. And so that's where the material, again, you get a lot of movement with no increase in force. So you kind of have this very constant force section. In this particular example, at 6%, the tensile tester is reversed. And so the strains are reversed and the forces or the stress drops dramatically right off the bat. And then it gets to this unloading plateau, and it's basically the opposite of the loading plateau. Now the material is contracting, but the force is very constant. And then it gets down again 1% metaphorically in this example, and it drops back down, the force drops back down to zero. There is a tiny bit of permanent set here. This is often specified as something like 0.25% after 6% strain, or 0.5% after 8% strain, something in that order. But there is a tiny bit of permanent set, but this loop between the loading plateau and the unloading plateau is the superelastic loop. That's sort of where the so-called magic of superelasticity takes place. Again, this superelastic loop is great for all the things mentioned on the left: crush resistance, kink resistance, flexibility. This is the property that allows something like a guide wire to traverse that tortuous path of the vascular system, maybe come out into the heart, depending upon what therapy you're targeting. And instead of continuing in the curve that was just in the vessel before, it'll straighten out and gives it good torqueability and steerability. This superelastic loop is the key to this property that makes this material so useful in medical devices. We go to the next slide. So what's happening within the material? Again, we were talking about shape memory and superelasticity. There's this interrelationship between them. There's this relationship between the transition temperature of the material and the environment in which it's performing. And so again, how they perform is exactly the same physically, and we're going to talk about that here. So there's on the right, there's what I'll call the superelastic triangle. And so there's two types of shapes I want to highlight here. So there's kind of these weird grids, but on the lower left, you've basically got a square outer shape or rectangular outer shape with rectangular inner shapes. The outer shape represents the device or the wire or the bulk material. The inner shape represents what's happening within the crystalline structure of the material or the grains of the material. And so key to this superelasticity and shape memory is a phase transition. Most people are familiar with the most popular or the most familiar phase transition that people are familiar with is water. Water goes through a phase transition from ice to liquid and liquid to steam. This is a phase transition. It just happens to be a solid to solid phase transition. And like ice to water and how it keeps your drink cold, there is a heat flow between these phase changes. Anyway, so in the lower left, you've got this square outer form, you've got this square crystalline structure, and that is the high temperature or austenitic phase. If you cool that material down, the crystalline structure changes to martensite, but just in cooling the material, the bulk shape is still represented here as a rectangle. The wire will not have changed shape just by cooling it. So now if you deform this cooled wire, this shape memory wire, now you move to the lower right-hand corner. So now the Hole shape has been turned into a parallelogram. That again represents the bulk shape, the wire being bent, the stent flexing, whatever. But also the inner crystalline structure has also changed. It's now this aligned parallelogram shape, and that is the martensite shape. And now when you heat the material up, what's actually happening is the heat causes the inner crystals to want to bounce back to the austenite condition, and the inner crystals moving towards austenite is what returns the bulk shape, the wire, the left atrial appendage device, the stent, whatever it happens to be. That's what causes the material to move back to its original heat set home shape. And so this is the, again, this is the shape memory triangle. And then what happens with superelasticity is the transition temperature is, as we've talked about already, or the operating environment, or the environment that the device is performing in, often body temperature, 37 degrees for implantable devices, things like that. The transition temperature of the material is below that. And so what happens is you bend the material, and instead of temperature inducing the martensite, you stress induce the martensite. So in shape, in superelastic, you are basically moving between the two lower thirds of this triangle. Austenite, you bend it to deform martensite. As soon as you let go of it, the heat in the environment causes it to return to austenite and causes its shape to bounce back. So that's a little bit of superelasticity versus shape memory and the temperature effect of the two relative to the transition temperature. So if we go to the next slide. And so diving in, kind of combining what we've looked at in the stress strain curves and what we've talked about in the temperature relationship between the transition temperature and the environment that the device is performing in. Now we're combining those, and what we have here is a series of 6 graphs of the same hypothetical material being tensile tested at different temperatures. So this is all the same material. The only thing that's changing is the temperature that the tensile test is being completed in. So if we look in the lower left-hand corner at 50 degrees C, this is the standard superelastic loop that we've already talked about. And so if you pull it to 8%, goes along this loading plateau, you get a lot of movement at the same constant force. You release it, it drops down to the unloading plateau and again returns to 0, it bounces back. And as we've discussed, if you take this wire and you drop it into a dry ice alcohol bath, you will get this shape memory effect. The same material will kind of behave in a shape memory way because you've lowered the temperature. This is what happens in the graph on the lower right at -40 C. So now you're tensile testing this material at -40 C, you pull it to 8%, but it doesn't recover all the way. It recovers to about 5%, and then it stops. In order to get it to recover all the way, you would need to apply heat in this case. But it's not on or off, or it's not binary. It's not only shape memory or only superelasticity. There's a relationship all along the spectrum of temperature. So what we have here is the other example. So at 10 degrees C, this material still behaves superelastically. You pull it to 8%, it bounces back to 0, but the loading plateau and the unloading plateau are much lower than they were at 50 C. The material will feel, well, not only will it feel less stiff, it will be less stiff at that temperature. And if you increase the temperature, you basically go the other direction. At the higher temperatures, 160 degrees C, the loading plateau is very far up there. And then an interesting thing happens if you get high enough at 200 degrees C. Again, these are metaphorical temperatures for conversational purposes. There's nothing magical about 200 degrees C. It's just for description's sake. But in this case, at 200 degrees C, this hypothetical material no longer exhibits shape memory or superelasticity. It just looks like the classic aluminum or steel curves, linear elastic section, rolls over in permanent deformation and breaks. And what's happening here is that at this temperature, the force needed to stress-induce martensite, which is how you get superelasticity, the force needed to stress-induce martensite is so high, it's above the force needed to create classical slip dislocation deformation. And so you don't get superelasticity or shape memory, you just get kind of a conventional behaving material at higher temperatures. Again, there's nothing magical about these temperatures, it's just for example's sake. Different materials will behave on this spectrum, but the curves will be slightly different. Move on to the next slide. In the interest of time, we're going to go very quickly on this slide. What I'm going to say is there's a range of temperatures that you can use to shape set your device, and that will affect the transition temperature of the device. So at the top on the right, you've got a shape set, kind of conical shape. On the left is what that device looks like coming off the laser cutter. The tines or the legs curl in and kind of touch one another, and that's just residual stress in the tubing or heat affected zone, things like that. That's not a problem. You can shape set it as you need, but in doing this shape setting, you've got these in the lower right hand, this graph, you've got some very unusual curves. This is a TTT curve, and so there's basically a curve that looks like delta AF plus 10 degrees C, delta AF plus 20 degrees C. Along that curve, you will move the transition temperature that amount by that heat treatment. So for example, if you do a heat treatment at 500 degrees C for about 10 minutes, you'll kind of be between the plus 10 degrees C and the plus 20 degrees C curves, and you will move the transition temperature of the material by that amount. This is sort of how you tune the properties. In the previous graph, we looked at how the different temperatures, how the material behaves at different temperatures, that's relative to a given transition temperature. This is how you move the transition temperature. And you can kind of play with all of that to get the device performance that you want. I'll leave it at that. You can pause this presentation later and study that graph. There's a lot going on there. But in the interest of time, let's move on. Another processing step that's very useful for many medical devices, particularly permanently implanted devices, is electropolishing. This is basically the opposite of plating. Plating puts material on the outer surface. Electropolishing removes material from the outer surface. You will have a lighter device after electropolishing than you do before. What's happening is ions are flying off the surface, and they're flying off the surface in such a way that the sharp points shown on the kind of magnified graphic there on the right, the start is very jaggedy, like the Rocky Mountains, and the finish is much more smooth, maybe like the Appalachian Mountains, or if you continue on, you'll get the plains of the Midwest. But what's happening is the ions are being removed, and it is smoothing the surface. The other thing that this material removal will cause to happen is things like a stent. When it's laser cut, you'll have these fairly square strut elements. The corners will, more material will be removed from the corners, and you will round the corners. The other thing, one of the other benefits that electropolishing will give you is improved biocompatibility. This will happen through several mechanisms. This removal of material will give you this nice surface finish that will create less trauma to the tissue that it's coming in contact with, but it will also, electropolishing will also lay down a thin adherent oxide layer, and this will improve your your corrosion resistance. The main method for testing corrosion resistant in small implantable medical devices or nickel titanium implantable devices is potentiodynamic corrosion testing, ASTM F2129, and it measures the breakthrough potential. This thin adherent oxide layer will prevent that breakthrough of corrosion and will give you better corrosion resistance. And also, this smoothing will improve your fatigue resistance. Cracking in fatigue is basically crack propagation, and if you have a smoother surface to start with, you will have less opportunity for a crack to start, and then that alone means that your crack propagation is going to be delayed, and electropolishing will improve your fatigue performance. Again, there's a lot going on here, but it's a very, very useful process for many, many implantable devices. Heart valve frames, left atrial appendage devices, stents, you name it. This last image of my section is a device. It's a mapping catheter tip, and it kind of brings all of these processes together. This started out as a laser cut Nitinol tube. It was then shape set quite drastically into this sphere or light bulb or hot air balloon shape, and it's also been electropolished. And so one of the things that I'm reminded of that I did not mention earlier that I meant to is electropolishing. Also in this smoothing of the surface, this device is delivered through a catheter, and that smooth surface makes it easier to slide the device in and out of the delivery catheter, and thereby making the delivery easier for the surgeon. And so that's it. Well, that's not it, but that's all the time that I have to cover. But those are the basics of Nitinol: transition temperatures, shape superelasticity, shape memory, and electropolishing. And again, this is just the start of the conversation. We'd be happy to take your questions if you contact us at a later date.
Thank you very much for that, Brock. This was very helpful information, and I think this is a great example, this part here, of the interrelationship of being able to perform the laser cutting, the shape setting procedure that you spoke about, and then also surface treatments like electropolishing. And being able to do this all in a controlled environment in one location gives us the opportunity to maximize the critical aspects of the customer design and give them the best fitting product for their needs.
Yeah, now, really quickly, I was going to say it's important. What you mentioned is important to match the processes to the device. Some devices don't need electropolishing. Maybe you're overlaying a polymer and you want the rougher surface that microblasting gives you, but that's all dependent on the device that you're working on.
That's very true, Brock. Thank you for that. We've now finished the overview on Nitinol. We'd like to take a little bit of time because we did mention how there was laser cutting involved in the formation of that product, and we want to just provide a little bit of reference information that you can use after this presentation, speaking about the types of laser systems that we employ and how these laser systems really provide different types of process parameters, and also they're used in different ways. You'll have more traditional manufacturing laser systems, the bedrocks of the technology maybe 20, 30 years ago. You'll have also technology that's being employed today as cutting edge technology, and then future technology here that is going to be really allowing for us to go into future applications. And that really comes down to power, duration of the beam, and also the amount of heat effect zone and what you could call dross or slag that you get from the cutting process. But please feel free to look over this slide, and if you have any questions, as Brock mentioned, we will be providing you contact information, and we're very happy to take your questions. Now, in the overview, I mentioned that we would talk a little bit about vendor selection or who you can partner with when working with Nitinol. And we feel that that's extremely important when it comes to having a successful project. So we have a couple of slides here just really to talk about this. Now, the first slide that we have here is really one about the most important questions that you should be asking as you're looking to have a project and finding that vendor for that project. And it really comes into identifying your strengths, your areas that you can use assistance on, and how prospective partners can match up to that. What you want to find is a company that can augment you where you need assistance and be able to have the breadth of capabilities, expertise, and technology to support you, because depending on the project and the application, what you are considered to have a good amount of knowledge or expertise on versus what you need assistance could vary. So these are just a small sample of questions that you can go through. And as you work through each of these, think about how that partner can support you through that. And then what you'll see here also is just a couple of tips that we recommend when it comes to making that final vendor selection. And again, it really is about thinking through the entire process, from the creation of your concept all the way through the development here. And there's some major milestones that you can see through this. The ability to help you in that early design, the ability to really help you with where you have those gaps or that expertise that you need to help make that concept into a buildable product and then into a repeatable product. Also, with these products, getting through quality and regulatory necessary steps and the ability to support that is also very critical. And then also, does these partners that you select have the same engineering, quality, and manufacturing setup and vision that you have as well? Are they able to support you in early development all the way through what you could consider the production phase of your product? These are key elements that you should think about. These are key ways to instill success if you find that right partner. Now, on behalf of Brock and myself and everyone at Heraeus Medical Components, I do want to thank you very much for taking the time to sit through this introduction and discussion into Nitinol. It is, as Brock said, the first part of a greater discussion. There's so much more material that we could cover, but in the hopes of keeping it into a very manageable format, what we'd like to share with you real quickly is some information on Heraeus, our web address, and also our LinkedIn page. Brock and I are able to assist you with any issues that you have, answer any questions that you might have, and most importantly, help you with those projects and those products that you're looking to bring to market. Again, thank you very much and have a great day. Goodbye.